Hello and welcome to Brockley News Extra, the programme where you get another chance to catch up on our recent interviews, including updates from in and around the hospital, local charities and special guests. I'm Alan Joyce, and coming up today we have a very special interview with writer and photographer Melanie Gow, who walked for 33 incredible days across the Pyrenees and through Spain with her two sons. Along the way, she took loads of photos, which led to her publishing a book called Walking with Angels. You'll hear her incredible story over the next hour. Don't forget, Radio Brockley is with you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, always available for your requests on 8954 6591 on the internal phone extension 5483. So stay tuned to London's official #1 hospital radio station, London's longest running hospital radio station, Radio Brockley. So we have a real treat for you today on Brockley News Extra. Prepare to be amazed and inspired by what you're about to hear. Let's join our reporter, Ron Laver.
My guest in the studio today is Melanie Gow. Melanie is a photographic artist and writer. She was born and brought up in Kitale, a remote town in Kenya, East Africa. And Melanie's father handed her his Pentax camera when she was just 6 years old. And her mother taught her to read before she went to school. She has travelled with a pen and a camera ever since. Good morning.
Good morning, Ron. Thank you so much for having me.
It's really nice to have you here. You've got a new book out that we'll talk about in a little while, which is called Walking with Angels. It's a photographic journey.
It is.
And it's a beautiful book. I've got a copy in front of me, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But I'd like to start off by going back and just having a quick run through some key points in your life, because having read about it and having seen some of the pictures, I think a lot of what comes before
leads up to the story.
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
perceptive of you, Ron.
So, you were born in Kenya. Were you first generation or...?
I was second generation, born in Kenya. Kenya is a unique colony in British history in that it was founded and handed back in one lifetime. So my grandparents on both sides were the founding wave. And one of my grandparents, my grandfathers, went out to put in the East African power and lighting. And the other stowed away on a boat from Nottingham, going to the first destination out of the harbour, and or the harbour that he left from, and that ended up in Kenya. And he just got off the boat there at Mombasa and made his way to Uganda, and ended up farming coffee, but forming a cooperative. And this was before fair trade. So he got all of the coffee growers together and said, if you club together, you can maintain prices. And they built, well, the first thing they built was a church, then they built a medical centre, and then they built a school, all on the proceeds of working together as a cooperative. So I feel I'm very proud of that kind of heritage. So my parents were then born there, and I was second generation born in Kenya, just at the point when it was handed back, and very much my parents were asked to choose between the two countries. And they chose to give me the future they thought was best. And they came to Britain, which fortunately gave us a home.
So when you were growing up in Kenya, was it a farm? Were you living on a farm?
Yes, my parents bought my farm, or our farm, with 2 horses and 50 quid they borrowed from the bank. And it wasn't on the good land. All land was kind of hard out there, and they spent their whole lives trying to farm a life out of the dust and the locusts and the...
So they didn't inherit the coffee business?
Because there was nothing to inherit, it belonged to the people.
Of course, yeah.
So my father, though, wanted to continue to work and be on the land, and farming was the way in which to make some sort of sustainable life for a family. But when we were repatriated, we spent a period of time on a carnation farm where my father worked for a Dutch company, and I sort of see the world changing. My father and my mother's first life was very old school. It was living off the land, and then big corporate. The very first corporate moved to Africa and built a carnation farm, and that's where the carnations that you get in the supermarket come from, was from the backyard of my old home. So my father went to spend a bit of time working for a carnation farmer before coming to England.
Were you old enough then to appreciate the difference between those two setups.
The two differences, it's like a different normal. They have had a significant impact. I think it's there was a formative experience. I was 12. I know I was born and brought up in Kenya, East Africa, and I've had to learn the ways of an entirely new culture. And it's that new normal and that experience of being in two different places and two different ways of thinking that have very, very much informed how I've brought up my children. I've always wanted them to know that there was different normals, different ways of thinking, and not just so that they would understand and be tolerant and empathetic, but that actually they'd have more resources to make different and new decisions, because I'm growing up the future here, and I feel that the way I can do that is to raise their skills and raise their resources so that they can make hopefully better decisions for the planet as they go forward.
Was there an enormous gap then between what I call the European Kenyan experience to what you found back here in the UK when you came? Your grandparents were British, and in a way you're coming home and you think about the British abroad. We tend to colonise everything and make it a little Britain. So was there a huge jump when you came back to the UK?
Yes, because my grandparents were Victorians. So, my grandmother was born in 1898, and so the Britain that we came back to was nothing like the Britain that they had grown up in. They had grown up pre-war. The whole world changed in that time. Very, very rapidly we've expanded or changed, and technology has just accelerated our evolution in a way that we don't even know how. So when I came back, I didn't live the white mischief, the colonial lifestyle of gin and tonics on the veranda in the evening, because I was a poor white farm girl. So my life was very much connected to the land.
Really?
And there, I think the key difference is that in Africa, the survival is physical. It's about whether you can get home that night if the buffalo will let you pass, or can you get through the year because it's the third in a drought, and can you physically survive? Whereas the West and England is much more of a mental survival. It's about your acuity. It's about whether you can hold onto your mental space in the way we are, and we're very fast. And we have, of course, accelerated in those two generations that I was in Kenya, in that we're always in a hurry. We're always going to the future. And we're in this little bubble. That allows us to live in this bubble that's all about us. Whereas the experience in Kenya was much more in the present. It was much more connected to the earth and at that pace. So those two different experiences couldn't, in my opinion, be more different. But I've been back to Kenya since, and funnily enough, it's not a museum that remembered all my childhood and kept it, preserved it. Africa itself has moved and kept up with the times. But for me, at the time that I transitioned, it could not have been more different.
That's interesting. Just going back while you were still in Kenya, your father gave you his old Pentax camera.
Well, I will make a small amendment there because it's quite important. It was his new Pentax camera, his sparkling new Pentax camera. And as a little girl, when you're trusted with your parents' new thing, it just has this sort of sparkly treasure that elevates it above being handed as something else. So I was given Daddy's new, and it had buttons and it moved the lens and all sorts of things like this. So this was also a new technology. We'd moved from the box brownie to this sparkly new technology, which is unrecognisable nowadays.
And was that something you immediately took to? I mean, was it, wow, did you find it was like an extension of you in a way,
yes,
I guess.
It
As a photographer now, it has to be. But then was that something that made you went, oh, this is,
Well, the interesting thing is, my father used it to look at the small microcosms in the world around us. He photographed insects. I have boxes of slides of close-ups of insects, and he built a trench underground just so that and put a piece of glass up and a hide, just so that he could photograph an underground a ground hoopoo nest. And, these photographs never went anywhere. This was just him completely engaged with his life and his surroundings and the magic of it. And of course, if somebody shows you something is magical, you do see it, you believe. And so I grew up seeing the world through my father's eyes. And that meant when I was using the camera, I was asking, why did I notice a particular moment as opposed to any other? Because we all notice different moments. It was very much less about the camera and how to use it, but so much more about it helped me to notice what I was looking at. And that made me notice. And all my life, that's been what it is. The question, why am I noticing this moment? What is my relationship to this moment, the planet, and deliberately, what does that mean to me? So it became an extension of my mind and a way of articulating myself to myself. When you're growing up, that's quite a unique thing. It's a fantastic gift he gave me.
That's really interesting. So when you moved to the UK and at obviously a later age, you married and you had children. Then there was a significant event, wasn't there, with your eldest child? I think that he was not very well.
Well, you know how it is. You have a life plan.
Yeah.
You're there at 16, in my case, being a girl. I was, going to get a good education, get a career, meet the right man, have children, live happily ever after. So the live happily ever after, I now look back and realise, was slightly devoid of detail. It was a broad stroke. So when my first child came along, there was a very sudden realization that this was the biggest idea I could possibly have. It was the biggest idea anybody can have, and therefore a huge priority, and became instantly, I understood that it would be what would teach me for the rest of my life, it would be my biggest growth. And my son was sick. He only suffered from allergies, eczema and asthma, which was very, very common, which is quite important because then a lot of people also suffered. He did happen to be one of the top 5% sufferers. So we were travelling into London to see the hospitals there for the paediatrics there, and we were here. Where I live, I had a doctor's appointment every week, and he ended up on a drug every 2 hours of his life. There was a steroid for the night and a steroid for the day, and everything down to painkillers every 2 hours. We had to swap. At some point, he became profoundly, if temporarily, deaf from all of the infection. So that he had he had sinusitis and osteomyelitis and all sorts of things going on. So we went to the hospital, or the doctor at that point, and he said, "Your son is deaf, and he's learning phonetics right now. So that's why he's getting learning difficulties, because he can't hear. So what we're going to do is we're going to operate." And it's a very common procedure. It's grommets. There's nobody out there who's listening should be afraid. It's a common procedure. But they said to me, "Your son is going to have so many operations. There's a 70% chance of permanent scarring, which will result in permanent deafness." And that's when I went home, and I felt very informed, but also very slightly. I couldn't believe that what I was doing wasn't making anything better. And that's when I sat down and reread everything I'd at that point collected and informed myself with. We're intelligent creatures, and we have a great deal of access to information now. So I'd made a use of it all. And the fascinating thing is, once I was approaching it from this perspective, with this deadline ahead of me that we were going to start this process that would make him permanently deaf, I read the information in a completely different way. And 93 experts said that the only effective way to treat what my son had was through environment and diet. And I did notice neither of those were available on a prescription at that point. So that's what we did. I changed our house. I put in laminate flooring. I took every soft furnishing out of the house, and I left him with a very hard Buzz Lightyear toy, because that was the film that came out at the time, and that was his love. He used to pretend to be Buzz Lightyear all the time. And I changed his diet. I fed him on rice, raisins, water, and lamb. And that was it. And 3 months later, he was off all conventional medicine.
Wow.
Within a year, he was running long distance running, cross country. So I then sat down and thought, how could I make this experience of mine meaningful? I'm not a health practitioner, and then I realised what I was a mother, and what I was an expert in my own child. So I spent 5 years travelling with my children to places like India and picking up their medical philosophies, and Australia and Africa again, and America for neurolinguistic programming. And over that 5 years, I obviously was also raising my son and his younger brother by now, but I was travelling and researching why what I had done had worked. And I wrote a book called Toasters Don't Roast Chickens. That's not a plug for it. You can buy it for 1p on Amazon. But that, for me, was the best friend. I was trying to write the best friend that I didn't have during the experience. And, this is the same child that I have now just walked 800 kilometres across the country with. So I look at it and I think if we had not reversed that formative experience with him, we would not be in a position that we are in today.
What age was your son, by the way, at this stage?
Well, he's sick at 3 months, and then by 3.5 years he was on.
That's when he was on all the drugs.
All the drugs.
Now, I just wonder how much of your previous life in Kenya, and you said yourself, it being in the UK these days, it's about yourself and this crazy world we live in, and when you're in Kenya, you said about you were very much, it was the land and surviving on the land, etc. I assume that influenced your decision.
It's very perceptive of you, Ron, actually, because you're the first person who's asked me that. I grew up where witch doctoring was common. So I have seen extraordinary transformational recoveries based on mental ability to think differently. So physical diseases have been recovered from because somebody believes they can. So I did have that experience. I also lived near a forest called Kakamega, where there are colobus monkeys. It's one of the last forests where there are colobus monkeys. And the rangers there don't have very much to do there because there are not many tourists. This is a place that we try to keep secret from people who really don't want to go there. So there are guides who will help you to go through the forest, but they don't have anything to do every day. There's the odd missionary comes past and the odd businessman. So what they ended up doing was they ended up observing the colobus monkeys, and then they'd meet back at the camp in the evening and they'd swap stories. And at some point, they started to notice the colobus monkeys, when they had eaten a rotten banana or something, had a stomach problem, would all go and eat the same plant afterwards. And so they then started to investigate the qualities and the properties of those plants and eat them themselves when they'd eaten. So they started mimicking the self-healing habits of the colobus monkeys to see and experiment on themselves, see if it worked. So I'd grown up in this really very up close and personal experience of different ways of treating. So yes, when we were in Kenya, we got, say, for example, diarrhea. Coke was the most effective cure.
You're talking about Coca-Cola?
Well, I'm talking about an unbranded cola of any kind.
Yes.
If you have diarrhea, Coca-Cola is what I'm talking about.
Well, I must admit, I've heard, I do know people that take it flat.
Yes. And that is how you're supposed to take it in that case. And of course it's because it's full of sugars and minerals, which rehydrate your body very fast. So we didn't have access to all of the conventional medicine that is thankfully on tap here. So I grew up in a very resourceful area. So yes, I do believe that when I found myself in that situation, I had another experience that I could draw on that could help me to make different decisions. And I think that's what I was saying before about trying to give my sons different experiences so that you can become better problem solvers. It's very interesting.
Yes, absolutely, and hence the title of your book, Toasters Don't Roast Chickens.
Yes, if you only go to see a conventional doctor, it's like only using a toaster. Now, there's nothing wrong with toast. We all pretty much like it for breakfast, but you will never eat roast chicken, was the thinking behind that title. And there is a world of treatment out there, certainly for our health. And the World Health Organization, number one on the list of top 10 things that make people healthy is being happy. Number 2 is social contact. Number 3 is creative or hobbies. And I can assure you, somewhere on there is smoking or not smoking, moderate drinking, and nowhere on there is medical treatment.
No.
It's very interesting.
It's very interesting, isn't it?
There's absolutely nothing wrong with conventional medicine. That there's more we can do for ourselves.
And I think here at the Orthopaedic Hospital, where obviously there's a huge sort of physical content to the illness, if you like, people are suffering, and the medical science goes a long way to help them. I think all the clinicians would agree. A lot of it, the more you can think it, the more you can think, right, I'm going to beat this, the more likely you are to do that. And I think that's very important, and you've demonstrated that. The other thing, I guess, with your son's illness, it's very much an illness of today, isn't it? It's interesting you said you put laminates down and took things out the house, because asthma, eczema, things like that are all
modern ailments.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they were there years ago. The incidence just is climbing all the time, isn't it?
I'm obviously not necessarily an expert, but I can tell you what the experts say, so I can be their mouthpiece, but I am standing on the shoulders of giants here, is that our lifestyle, it creates a lot of the problem. Now, it's a complex, complex influences are involved. Our nutrition could be improved. Our environment is actually probably too clean. But what I did find is that my son was allergic to dust and cats and dogs. Now, none of those things are actually something that he should be afraid of. Our bodies do not naturally need to defend themselves against cat dander or dust. But it was explained to me and effectively treated by neurolinguistic programming that the body can make a mistake. It learns that cat dander is dangerous, maybe because it got a cold or a virus at exactly the same time when there was a lot of cat dander in the air. So it's got a mixed message. Now, if it has learnt to identify cat dander and dust as dangerous, it can also unlearn that connection. And that's what, in this particular case, NLP did with my son. There was a fast allergy process. It was incredibly effective. But I did this work with him, and 2 days later, he was 5 years old, and he turned to me and he said, "Mummy, the black cat has gone." And I was like, what black cat is he talking about? And he then demonstrated with his hands that he could see up in the right-hand corner of his eye, just above his eye, in space in front of him, there had been a black cat silhouette with a red circle and a red line across it, like a stop sign. And that had gone. And that what was fascinating is he's 5, so he doesn't know anything about mind maps. He hasn't got any information to match this to. For him, that was just a reality. And he was not allergic to cats after that.
Wow.
So it was very interesting because,
very, very interesting.
the power that... So we were talking about modern medicine and the mind. If we can draw all our resources together and not just isolate our treatment for one thing. If you need conventional medicine for something, that is absolutely important you get it. And then if you can layer in, a great attitude and some nutrition and things like that, you're giving yourself an even better chance of getting back to balance, because that's what we're all trying to do, is remain in homeostasis, which is a balance.
That takes us on nicely to the book, your current book, Walking with Angels, A Photographic Journey. I'll just read a couple of testimonials here from the book. This has the emotion of a film and the excitement of a live performance and the impact of igniting a dream. Highly recommended. In fact, it should come with a warning. It is very likely to be inspiring and life-changing.
I'm incredibly humbled by the response that the book has had. The book is based on a journey that I took with my sons. It was over the Pyrenees and across Spain for 800 kilometres, and we walked it for 33 exceptional days. And if I go back to how it all started, it was on a Tuesday night. We watch a lot of films. Mostly we watch caped crusaders saving the world, and I have no problem with those kind of films because I've got 2 boys. But every once in a while they let me watch a mummy film, in inverted commas, and there was a film called The Way. It's by Martin Sheen and Emilio Estevez, and it's about this walk, which is essentially a pilgrimage. There was nothing in this film that my sons should have appealed to them, because it's about middle-aged people walking and talking. But fascinatingly, as the end credits rolled, my son stood up and said, "Can we do that?" And there was something so true. You know, when kids ask you for something, Mummy, can I have that toy? And you go, yes, of course you can. Put it on your Christmas list, knowing full well they'll forget it. There was something about this request that was very true. And I, in that moment, had to decide whether to tell them to put it on their bucket list or step up to the plate and be the mother I'd pretty much, told them I was, but had never really, really proved. There were 3 people in the room that wanted to do this walk, so it seemed easy to say yes. But of course, my sons had absolutely no idea. They were 16 and 12. They had absolutely no idea what it actually involved. And although I had an intellectual idea about what it actually involved, the physical challenge of doing it was somewhat different.
I can imagine. Just, you said that all 3 of you said, yeah, let's do it. Was there also, from your point of view, that decision, again, does that go back to your son's illness and even back to your early life and thinking, wow, this is great, this is really getting back to the land, back to nature?
Well, it was almost the grand quest. I knew that it would be a space in which my sons could decide what kind of men they wanted to be. I knew it was going to give them something that I couldn't give them. It was the best thing I could do with them. It was the best thing I could do for them. And I was going to get to spend time with them at a point when I was going to be letting them go. So I knew it had that kind of resonance. The biggest surprise about it was the profound transformation I experienced. I was transformed by leading them. So I didn't go knowing that we were all going to get back to the land. But I can tell you that whilst I was there, I was re-enamoured with the Cathedral of Nature, and this pace of walking just reconnects you or connects you to the land to the point where you can hear the earth whisper. So yes, it was full circle. Everything did come back. My subconscious may have known it, but not my cynical, grown-up self.
Tell us something about the walk now and the conditions on the walk. For instance, what was the first morning like?
Well, the first morning, you have to put it in context. We've taken 19 hours to get here. We've gone overnight on coach. We've got trains. We've got buses. We've got more buses. We've run. We've caught a cab. And we're finally in the middle of what is effectively nowhere because there's no transport infrastructure to get there that's easy. And it's 4:00 in the afternoon, and we've not taken into account that it's now 52 degrees, and that we've had no sleep. And we start to walk over the Pyrenees. The first 4 kilometres took us about 2 hours, and we were gasping for breath, but going, no, we've got this. The second 4 kilometres took us 3 hours, at which point my eldest son, the 16-year-old, threw up. And we decided that we would, I had to stop that night. I put him in a bunk bed in communal halls, not unwashed, and woke him up at 6:30 in the morning and took him to breakfast, which happened to be tea and yesterday's bread. And both my sons, to their credit, just went, well, we're pilgrims now. This is how it is. And we set out over the Pyrenees. It was a beautiful day. You have to imagine, clear, 360-degree blue skies. You're in the Pyrenees. It's beautiful. There are cowbells. You can hear the rhythm of those playing as they munch. They're walking freely across your path, and there was this mist, this early morning mist, and it cloaked a ferocious heart because there was a wind that you could not stand up straight in. Birds couldn't take off in this wind, and we had to get over a mountain on this bright sunny day. And the funny thing is, the Pyrenees are sort of roll like waves. They sort of cascade in on each other, and so we had this rolling, relentless seasickness as we were trying to get over this mountain. And my 16-year-old then took up throwing up again, and he threw up for 5 hours. It got to the point where he couldn't even keep water down, and all I could say to him was, please throw up downwind because I can't wash your boots. But my 12-year-old became very frustrated with his brother's inadequacies, so I had to sit there between the two boys. The 12-year-old walked off and said, I'm going ahead. And the 16-year-old sat down and said, I can't go anywhere. And this is the point where I was sort of standing there, so halfway between France and Spain, thinking, I'm the mother that wrote that book. What about how to take care of the health of your children? What kind of mother doesn't pack Lucozade tablets? Because I thought, at least if he got some glucose. The fascinating thing is that where my son had sat down was right opposite a grave. So when he'd actually gathered his composure, he looked at me and he went, I've got no choice, have I? And I went, no. So he got back up and he inched on. And about 3 minutes later, a man walked up to us and in a perfect Cambridge accent asked if my son was all right. So I was now able to speak in English, first time in 3 days. I just said, yep, he's in his own private hell. And this man turned to me and he said, I have no idea if it'll be of any help, but I've got a packet of Lucozade tablets in my bag. And that was our general experience. We went from these extreme emotions and these unbelievable physical challenges to these small coincidences. Think of them what you will. And that was our everyday experience.
That just seems a little bit more than a coincidence. There's something...
Well, I have to tell you that by the end of 33 days, those coincidences did not surprise me anymore, and they no longer do. They were extraordinary. It was an extraordinary 33 days that we did this. And my son, he then obviously at that point, he then walked 776 kilometres more. So that's what...
Your children sound like quite remarkable young adults as well.
Well, every parent thinks that.
I couldn't imagine my own children setting out and being in those circumstances and not just saying, let's go home.
Well, of course, that was the whole thing about this particular challenge, is that you can go home at any time. We were unfit, but we saw people who'd spent hours in the gym building the muscles for this who had to go home broken. We saw people go home because they drank bad water. We saw people go home because they got bored, or they didn't have the time, or it wasn't hedonistic enough. So the thing about a pilgrimage, and this is what happened. We went on a long walk that turned out to be a pilgrimage, and it was very much a pilgrimage to yourself, is it's about you every single day making the choice to get up. By day 3, I had blisters that were so bad I had to sew them every morning and leave a thread in them so that the fluid could drain during the day. And in all honesty, if I hadn't done that, the blisters may have sent me home. That managed them, but I then still had blisters every day for 33 days. And that in itself was a way of me learning that to be grateful to my feet. And you become more aware of your own body and what it's capable of, and you start listening to it. So, my second son walking off, the 12-year-old walking off in frustration, his particular nadir was that he realised that he had a chance of losing us. On our second day, we found a man kneeling on the ground weeping because he'd lost his companion. When you lose your companion in the middle of nowhere, you have no idea where to start looking. And that made my second son realise that by walking off, he'd run the risk of losing us. And the whole point was that he wanted to walk with us. And he had to change. And he became empathetic, almost compassionate. And what I saw in my sons, the change I saw in them was very, very deliberate and very, very measurable. My eldest son could not climb over a mountain on his first day. And a week from the end, he got called over in Spanish, so he didn't understand, by a man pushing another man in a wheelchair with his wife standing next to him, and got told to take over pushing this wheelchair. And there was just lots of gesticulating. He had to push it up a hill. And the child who couldn't walk over a mountain, by the end of the journey, was pushing an old man up the steepest hill in a wheelchair to a doctor's appointment. And that was the change for her. You could see that transformation. My youngest son, who walked off, impatient, was the one at day 17 when there was the longest stretch. And by this point, I could only walk 10 kilometres, and I would then just slow down to a snail's pace. My brain could keep going, but my body just was like, nope, you're not doing it, not fast. He is the one who dropped back and got me through that. And yet he was the one weeks earlier who'd walked off just because somebody had to sit down. So I could see the transformation in my children quite deliberately in that space and time.
It really was life-changing experiences, I guess, for you all, but certainly the children.
And of course they don't know it, do they? Because they went on this walk, and at their age, it built them up. So all they've done is gathered huge resources and a self-knowledge, and going forward, that hopefully will grow, and it's a part of them forever. It is a part of them forever. But at my age, it breaks down and strips away everything that made you what you've become and leaves you with who you are. So I smile because I can see in them the effect it's had. They're centered, they're easy, they have a knowledge about themselves that's very enviable. But the reason I know it's true is that for the first time in my life, I am physically and emotionally in the same place at the same time, which is now. And this is a state of being that's very, well, it's kind of likable.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and to talk to you, and I've been talking to you earlier as well, as just in the interview here. There's certainly an air about you that is very relaxed, very happy,
Yes.
and it's half the battle in life. Well, it's probably 3/4 of the battle in life.
I think it's 3/4 of the battle.
Especially in this day and age.
And I realise it can go at any time, but I'll take it where I can get it.
Can I just draw you back to the walk again? And one incident that was on day 17, when you stopped at a cafe and had a drink and then had a problem getting up. Would you just recall that for us?
This is the day that everything changed. It was day 17. I felt I'd been walking since the 13th century by that point. We had to stop on the side of the road at a cafe to get a drink. And then when I stood up, my knee gave way. And it was so much pain that I was not going to be doing any more walking at that point. So next to our table was one of those advertising boards that had a taxi number along the top. Now, my 12-year-old at this point is a little bit canny. He said to me, "Maybe it's a sign, Mummy." And I laughed. And I thought, well, actually, you know what? They're not stupid. Yes. And I agreed. I said, okay, we will take a taxi. And both the boys turned to me and said, "No, Mum, you're taking the taxi. We're walking." And as they walked off, it was, it's one of those significant moments that is so tiny that you could overlook it, but had such an impact. As they walked away, I realised they had made the right decision for me, but the right decision for themselves. And I knew that was the last time I was going to see my boys. The next time I'd see them, they would be men. And it was only 6 kilometres. But they had to walk into a town that they had no idea what it was like. I only had the name of a place I was going to try and get into. They had to find that, then they had to find me. And I had to resist asking people to look out for them and make sure they were okay, and let them figure it out for themselves, which of course they did. And that night was really beautiful. This was in a part of the walk. It's 270-kilometre plateau. It is so flat and shadeless. There's not a tree. That you're walking in 52-degree heat. It's 30 kilometres between any kind of town. So there's no stopping off for coffee. There's no shade. There's no relief. So lots of people navigate round this by taking the train. But so if you walk this bit, you are equal to anybody who walks it, no matter what your age is. So there were some men other pilgrims sitting outside a bar in the sun, having beers, and they called my sons over. Sat them down, and they had their very first boys' night out. And they deserved it. They were treated as equal by men from all around the world with the same values. And the funny thing is I, at that point, thought, you don't get your first night out ever again. So I'm just going to leave them to it. And when you walk this, there's nothing else to see when you go into remote villages except, say, the church. And you get into the habit of going to the church because that's where all the art is. And it's extraordinary. It's beautiful art. And, of course, it's all built in devotion. These buildings are built to the hope of humanity. So it's the best of human nature. So actually, I started to get really quite interested in going to all of the churches. So I thought, well, I've heard this one's lovely. I'm going to go to the church. And I got there at the time that the service was on. And we're going to call this a coincidence, in inverted commas. It happened to be the day of Assumption in the Catholic Church. This is the day that celebrates Mary, the Mother of God, Mother of Jesus. And the sermon by the priest that day was all about the importance of motherhood and the grace of a relationship between a mother and child. Now, you can imagine, I listened to that. By the end of it, I was very slightly weepy. But there were also some Colombian nuns who stood up and gave this speech about hope and the importance of it. And then she started to sing a song. She accompanied herself on a guitar that said, "Everything changes except love." By the time they were giving out little stars they'd cut out of paper and coloured on it that were as gifts to us, I cried for 3 days, but not in sorrow, in gratitude, in an absolute knowledge that what I had come for subconsciously was because I was a mother, and what I had was confirmation I'd done my job, and that was it. It was by this point the rest of the pilgrimage they were on their own and I was on mine. We were still walking together, but I was no longer on the same journey. So that was day 17, very significant.
It's interesting in the whole of this journey. I don't think you've mentioned, well, should we just pack up and go home? And having talked to you now, I can't imagine you ever doing that. But remarkably, your sons as well.
And actually, they never did that. I'm not saying that we didn't have arguments or things like that. People get tired, and in fact, the biggest fallout was the very last day when we were walking into Santiago. You stop outside of the town of Santiago de Compostela, which is, the spiritual end of this. The pagan end is 3 days later at the edge of the earth, where you can then watch the sun die. But we were walking to Santiago de Compostela. And you stop outside, and what you're supposed to do is take a shower and get into clean clothes so that you don't smell in the church the next day. This is a ritual. And the next morning we woke up, and both my boys fell out with each other in such a hard way that both of them were ending up crying, and I don't think I'd ever heard them sort of throw such harsh words at each other. There was nothing mean about it. They were just, and it was the knowledge that it was over, So in fact, this incredibly hard thing was something that once we were there, we didn't, that they were grieving about the fact it was actually
It was
over.
like an emotional offload, wasn't it?
Yes. And obviously, as soon as we got there, what my second son wanted to do was walk back. But we, live in modern times, so we had flights booked.
Yeah. So you've, and from that, and throughout all this, you were taking photographs.
Yes.
And you've produced this beautiful picture book, Walking with Angels. Just open it here, and you've put little. It's not just pictures. There's quite a bit of text there, explaining your thoughts and how the days progressed, etc. How much of this did you go intending to produce a book from this?
No. I didn't intend any of this to happen. I certainly did not intend to be sitting here nearly 2 years later talking to you, Ron, still about it. I am incredibly privileged and incredibly honoured to. It goes back to the way photography works for me. I look at something and I ask why I'm noticing one particular moment over another. And a lot of these photographs are actually narrative. There's a lot of metaphors in them and a lot of the lessons that we learnt on the walk. On day 3, this is after my first son is thrown up, for one whole day. My second son has realised that he's going to lose his family if he doesn't change. And I've, had to start sewing my feet in the morning. We also, on that day, we met somebody who told me my problem was I was carrying too much and that I had to, if I wanted to stay on the road, I had to give my backpack away. I had to stop carrying the weight. And, this was a very interesting part for me because I had this belief that I could do this perfectly, like a Lara Croft figure, and that I had to actually stop trying to be perfect and get on with the job, much more interesting job, of being myself. And I turned to my sons and I was like, I'm very much the problem here. I am the reason we might end up going home. And the woman I met that night told me this lovely story that there are stones, piles of stones on the side of the road, and they're quite a common symbolic thing in many cultures, but in this specific story, you're supposed to take a stone from home that represents your burdens, and at the end of the walk you put them down in and you then obviously metaphorically shed your burdens, and you're absolved of all of your sins. But she said to me, you can put the stone down at any time and somebody else will pick it up and carry it a bit of the way for you. And then when you're strong, maybe you pick up somebody else's stone and help carry it for a bit. And that way all the stones get to Santiago. And that, for me, was a metaphor. And so I've taken a photograph of that because it had that story in it. And I then put our backpacks on a taxi. For 5 days, we walked, because I couldn't get a smaller backpack. We walked for 5 days without any backpacks in order for me to be able to recover. Now, when we saw our backpacks again, I thought, that's never going back on my back ever again. And we shed 3/4 of everything we had. And I walked for the rest of the time with everything I carried fits on an A1 piece of paper. So, but on the morning that I walked out without a backpack was the very first morning we saw sunflower fields. And they're just sunflowers. But to me, the story of sunflowers goes back to a Maori saying, which is face the sun and let your shadows fall behind you. So the reason I noticed the sunflowers was because that was the lesson in it. So that's what the photographs mean to me. And the funny thing, of course, is that, I did say earlier, you get stripped of everything that's made you what you've become and you're left with who you are. So for days, I found I was responding to the world exactly as who I am. And I was taking pictures and holding the stories. And taking pictures and holding the stories. And when I came back from the walk, within 3 weeks, my local town had offered me a space at the back of the town hall in the Age Concern Cafe to put on an exhibition about the walk. I hadn't articulated it for myself by that point, but I understood this wasn't about me anymore, that people were interested in the story. So I put this this exhibition up, and their friends said to me, you should give a talk. And of course I sort of let 20 friends come, because I at this point was still pacing up and down, sort of go, oh, and I remember this, and then this happened. There was there was no coherence to it.
Yeah.
But by the end of the year, we came back in September. By the end of the year, I had a gallery space in order to put on this story. And the gallery said, give a talk. And then it went to an art centre. And then it became a mobile exhibition that went as far as Edinburgh and was showing in the St. Giles Cathedral in the town centre there. And at every one of these, I gave a talk. And people said to me, can we have a book? And having written Toasters Don't Roast Chickens, I was like, yeah, sure. I'll write a book. And lots of words. And they all turned to me and said, no, we want a book with the pictures in, because they're narrative images and they hold all this meaning. So that's why it's a picture book.
And it is a very beautiful one as well. There's some. I mean, there's lovely landscapes. There's a lot of pictures of your children, other people, just observations, and I love those sort of observational pictures.
And it's very much the the metaphors, the lessons we learnt, a sense of the landscape you're walking through, so that you get an idea. But the opening picture is of a door that I found that was padlocked.
Yes, I just opened on that one.
And one of the main lessons we learnt from this is that there is a closed door lets nothing in. And I saw that door the day after my children had walked off, leaving me in the cafe. And I thought, if we had not come on this walk, then none of this that has unfolded since could have happened. And I then saw this closed door, and it was immediately a closed door lets nothing in.
I love the way that you see those metaphors in photographs. I like taking photographs, and they never quite come out how I see them, and I think part of that is looking at this. You see that they mean something to you. I look at a pretty scene, or a good, that's what it is. But you seem to be reading more into that and going beyond the picture and saying, what does that speak to me?
Ron, I would argue that that's also what you're doing, because I think the camera is the most amazing democratization of art. Because anybody can have one, and of course the best camera is the one you have on you, which for us is a phone. But when you're taking a picture, it's because you're noticing something, and that picture means a lot to you. And if we're going to look at it critically and say, is it a pretty picture or not? Well, that's a whole other thing, and that's not necessarily what's useful to you. What it is for you is the camera is allowing you to be in that moment and pause for 5 seconds or however long it takes and admire it. So you're saying, I see a beautiful landscape. It doesn't matter you didn't catch a photograph. Taking the photograph was there that made you stop and deliberate and take it. It's just, I think it's beautiful.
That's really fascinating. My wife complains whenever we go anywhere that I'm always 500 yards behind her, taking photographs.
Well, you now know how to argue with her.
Absolutely, yeah. Because she says to me, it's funny, isn't it? She says to me, I can't imagine what pleasure you get of looking at the world through a camera lens.
Well, that is the argument people throw at us, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And it's sometimes people say you're not experiencing the moment because you're using it through a camera, and it can, of course. It can be like that. You're so busy photographing the concert, you're not necessarily at the concert. But I would say that it has this other benefit to it. Everything has two sides. This other benefit of making you pause and appreciate it. What you're really doing is effectively a contemporary grace. When somebody posts a photograph on a social media network of their dinner and we're all deride it, actually what they're doing is contemporary grace. They're like going, look at that. Either they've made it or they think it's beautiful or whatever. And we have no vocabulary these days for appreciation necessarily or for exaltation. And so I think a camera is a very subtle way of going.
It's very interesting way of looking at it, particularly on some of the photographs you see on social media.
We must be generous with each other.
Absolutely. Well, Melanie Gow, it's been a really interesting time talking to you. The book is absolutely beautiful. Can you just tell our listeners where they can get a copy, where they can find out more about you?
Oh, thank you, Ron, for asking. The book is obviously available on that great online store with that we love and hate at the same time. It's also available on my website, or more information about me, or even being able to contact me, is on my website. And my website is called My Office Today, because that changes regularly. And what I do changes. So My Office Today is my website, but I'm also on Facebook and I'm on Twitter. And I do love hearing from people. So, this is about the inspiration getting out. My son saw a film and that changed their lives. And I realized when I was creating this book that it wasn't about me. It was about, this is how the inspiration gets out. So if people have questions, if people, want to know more, they're welcome to contact me. That'd be lovely.
And you give talks, don't you, as well? And you're always happy to talk to associations, schools.
I'm more than happy because, there is nothing greater than standing in a room and telling this story and just lighting up a potential idea in somebody's head, because an idea can take flight over an entire city. And they may not want to do this, but they may have a dream they want to make true. And we need to know that that's possible. And if we hear somebody's story, if a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old can make their dream come true, then it's possible for all of us.
Melanie, thank you very much for your time today. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me, Ron.
What an absolutely incredible story. And don't forget, you can catch up with this and other previous editions of Brockley News and Brockley News Extra by logging onto our website at radiobrockley.org and following the links to our YouTube site from there. And if there's anything else happening in and around the hospital which you want to find out more about, you can call us on extension 5483. Tell us what you'd like to know about, and we'll try and cover it on future editions of Brockley News. Stay tuned to Radio Brockley across the week for more information about the events and services available in the hospital, along with the widest range of music you'll ever hear to suit all tastes. And of course, you can now catch Brockley News Extra Mondays to Friday lunchtimes at midday and Monday evenings at 8 o'clock, plus Brockley News every Sunday for half an hour just before bedside bingo. From me, Alan Joyce, goodbye.